It was a warm evening in late October of 1974, the kind where the air clung softly to skin and the scent of wood smoke from distant chimneys mingled with the faint sweetness of fallen leaves. In a modest suburban home at the edge of town, the kind where every porch light burned steadily through the night, 5 siblings gathered for a sleepover that should have been ordinary. Laughter bounced off the walls, light and careless, weaving through the bedrooms and corridors like a song only they could hear. Pillows were fluffed, blankets tossed in joyful disarray, and the aroma of buttered popcorn curled from the kitchen into every corner of the house. Outside, the world seemed to slow, as though holding its breath, quietly bearing witness to the simple joy of childhood in motion. The oldest, barely 12, had taken on the role of temporary guardian, her voice a mixture of authority and teasing warmth as she orchestrated games and whispered secrets. Her younger siblings followed eagerly, eyes wide with the kind of trust only children can offer. They shared stories under dim lamplight, their faces glowing, punctuated by bursts of giggles and occasional shrieks of mock terror from a game half remembered. They spoke of imagined worlds and future adventures, the house vibrating with energy that seemed to promise nothing but safety. And yet, within that energy, there was a subtle tension, almost imperceptible, the quiet hum of the night pressing against the walls, the faint shadow that stretched too long in the hallway, the feeling of being watched without knowing why. It was the sort of tension a child might sense, but not name, the kind adults often dismiss until it is too late. As the night deepened, they moved from room to room, carrying flashlights like tiny torches against encroaching darkness. They whispered plans for the following day, argued over who would sleep closest to the window, and tried to outdo one another in daring dares that were playful yet tinged with bravado. Every sound, the creak of a floorboard, the rustle of curtains in the breeze, the low moan of wind through the trees, became part of their world, woven seamlessly into the tapestry of their laughter. The home, filled with furniture worn soft by years of family life, became a sanctuary, a fortress of shared memories and invisible bonds that seemed invincible in the innocence of childhood. Yet in those same walls, there was an undercurrent of uncertainty, something no one fully recognized until the morning light would arrive and reveal the impossible. Outside, the street had grown quiet. The neighbors, all tucked away in their own nightly routines, could not have predicted what would unfold, could not have known that the ordinary comfort of home would shatter so completely. It was a night that would be remembered not for its warmth, or its playfulness, or even its laughter, but for the sudden, terrifying absence of everything familiar. When morning came, the house remained still, untouched by any sign of struggle, any note left behind, any clue to explain the disappearance. Beds were unmade, toys scattered across the carpet, blankets twisted and warm from where the children had lain. The bowls of popcorn were abandoned, the small lamps still casting dim pools of light in corners, as if the world had paused mid-breath. And yet, the children themselves were gone. 5 siblings vanished without a trace, leaving only the echo of their presence behind, as though the walls themselves had swallowed them whole. The absence was immediate and overwhelming. The mother, already reaching for coffee, called for them in a voice that should have been ordinary, routine. When silence returned instead of laughter, a knot of fear twisted in her chest. The father rushed from room to room, opening doors, checking closets, scanning the backyard, each empty space reinforcing the unthinkable truth. Panic grew quickly, spreading through the house like wildfire. Outside, the neighbors emerged slowly, drawn by the escalating cries, the frantic knocking, the unmistakable tension that had no place in a neighborhood defined by calm streets and predictable routines. By midday, police had arrived, canvassing the block, questioning adults, retracing every step of the previous evening. Yet, despite their efforts, nothing surfaced. No footprints in the damp grass, no signs of forced entry, no notes or messages. The siblings had vanished from a house full of warmth and laughter as if the night itself had folded them away, leaving only their absence as evidence. And in that absence, a seed of something far darker took root, an unanswerable question, one that would haunt not only the family but the town itself for decades to come. How can 5 children simply disappear from the world they know, leaving behind nothing but the memory of who they were, and the weight of all that would never be again? Even as the sun climbed high, casting ordinary light across the quiet streets, the house remained a silent witness, its walls holding onto the last echoes of laughter, whispers, and promises. Every room, every hallway, every tiny corner seemed to remember the children in a way no living memory could fully capture. The night that began in innocence and warmth had become a rupture, a moment where the ordinary fractured, and the unimaginable began, a night that would mark the lives of everyone touched by it, not just through the absence of 5 siblings, but through the lingering, unrelenting shadow of a truth too terrible to imagine. By dawn, The news of the disappearance had rippled through the town like a stone cast into still water, each circle of shock growing larger, reaching every corner of the community. Streets that had been quiet, lined with familiar lawns and parked bicycles, now thrummed with unease. Neighbors emerged from their homes, drawn by the sight of police cars, the flashing lights, and the mounting tension that seemed to press on the very air. They whispered to one another in hurried, hushed tones, piecing together fragments of what little they knew, eyes darting toward the house where 5 children had vanished without explanation. No one could say what had happened, no one could even imagine it. The ordinary calm of the town had fractured, replaced by a collective anxiety that settled into the bones of every adult who had once believed their streets were safe. Families gathered on porches, clutching cups of coffee as they tried to convince themselves that it must be a misunderstanding, that the children had run off for some mischievous adventure, that they would return soon with cheeks flushed from excitement and stories spilling over. But the absence pressed down too heavily, and doubt took hold. It was not just a single child gone, a single moment of panic to resolve itself, it was 5. 5 voices that should have filled the home, 5 faces that should have been bright with energy, vanished. The impossibility of it hovered in the minds of everyone present, creating a quiet hysteria beneath the surface of orderly lives. At the police station, the investigation began with a frantic intensity, officers poring over reports, retracing the children's last known movements, and interviewing anyone who had been near the house the night before. Each lead was followed with meticulous care, yet each seemed to dissolve into emptiness. The neighbor who had seen a stranger lurking near the edge of the street couldn't remember their features. The delivery man who had dropped off a package reported nothing unusual, yet his recollections were vague, filtered through the lens of ordinary routine. The investigators themselves became characters in this unfolding drama, their confidence eroding as the threads of the case unraveled into frustration and uncertainty. Each door knocked on, each question asked, returned only silence or confusion. Amid the procedural chaos, the emotional toll on the family intensified. The mother's panic was immediate and raw. She paced the small rooms, her hands trembling, calling each child's name into the empty house as if the sound of her voice could summon them back. She clutched discarded toys, turning them over again and again, trying to reconcile the familiarity of these objects with the unbearable knowledge that the hands that had held them were no longer there. The father, stoic yet visibly shaken, retraced his own steps through the house, mentally measuring distances, imagining where the children could have gone, scolding himself for any perceived lapse in vigilance. The weight of guilt pressed down on him, mingling with fear, creating a sense of helplessness that seemed to grow with every unanswered question. Outside, the community responded in waves of solidarity and fear. Volunteers organized search parties, combing through yards, alleys, and nearby wooded areas, their voices calling for children who were already lost to the world. Strangers offered blankets and food to the family, their gestures sincere, yet tinged with the underlying dread that the missing could never be found. Each face that approached the home brought a mixture of hope and despair, the town collectively oscillating between belief and disbelief. In those streets, the ordinary rhythms of life, morning routines, school bus pickups, casual greetings, collapsed under the weight of uncertainty. Media attention arrived swiftly, the local paper splashing headlines across its front page, and radio broadcasts repeating the story in careful, anxious tones. Reporters arrived, notebooks in hand, eyes wide with the thrill and horror of the unfolding mystery, capturing the fear and disbelief that had taken hold of the town. Families were approached for interviews, their grief on display, raw and unfiltered, as journalists tried to parse the fragments of information into a coherent narrative. The cameras could not capture the full depth of the loss, nor the weight of the silence left behind by 5 small bodies that no longer existed in the world of the living. Children in the neighborhood were forbidden from going outside alone, parents holding their hands a little tighter, eyes constantly scanning for signs that might explain the inexplicable. The absence of the 5 siblings transformed the ordinary, everyday safety of the town into a fragile illusion. Every sound became a question, every shadow a potential threat. It was not just the missing children who were affected, it was the collective consciousness of a community suddenly confronted with its own vulnerability, its own inability to protect innocence. As the hours stretched into a long, unbearable day, the police continued their efforts, but even their presence could not quell the growing emotional storm. Families huddled together in living rooms, waiting for updates that never came, listening to the hum of television broadcasts repeating the same facts, the same uncertainties. Neighbors offered quiet reassurances, yet the tension only tightened, a coiled spring that threatened to snap. In the faces of every adult, there was a mirror of helplessness, a reflection of the unknown that hung like a shadow over the town. By evening, a sense of dread settled over the streets. The sun, sinking below the horizon, cast long shadows across lawns and sidewalks, transforming familiar places into unfamiliar ones. The house that had once been warm and inviting now loomed as a hollow monument to absence. Its windows reflected the fading light, the rooms within silent and waiting. In the darkness, the community could feel the weight of what had been lost, not just the 5 children, but the sense of security, the fragile belief that ordinary life would continue untouched. That night, the town slept uneasily, haunted by questions that had no answers, and by the lingering echo of laughter that would never be heard again. The disappearance did not simply vanish with the passage of hours or days, it embedded itself in the family, a silent, relentless presence that warped every thought and gesture. Within the walls of the house, grief and guilt became tangible entities, as if they could be touched, moved from room to room, filling every corner with a heavy, unyielding weight. The mother wandered aimlessly through empty hallways, her fingers trailing along the edges of furniture, pausing on each child's belongings as if she could coax their presence back into reality. She set the table for breakfast each morning with plates for 5, speaking softly to empty chairs, imagining conversations that would never come. Her voice echoed into the silence, unanswered, yet she persisted, tethering herself to rituals that were once mundane but had become acts of desperate remembrance. The father, equally shattered, retreated into an internal fortress. He measured distances in the backyard, pacing repeatedly, counting steps, checking locks and windows over and over, trying to make sense of the senseless. Each imagined misstep, each moment he had failed to notice something, weighed on him like stone. Nights became restless vigil, lying awake listening for sounds that might signal the return of the children. Footsteps on the stairs, laughter from the bedrooms, the small whispers of bedtime secrets. He could not sleep, could not rest, trapped in a loop of imagined scenarios, haunted by the impossible reality that 5 lives he loved most had evaporated into nothingness. Siblings and cousins, themselves children at the time, were forced to grow too quickly. The absence of their brothers and sisters was a ghost that accompanied every step, an unspoken reminder that joy could be stolen in a single night. They remembered little things, the smell of popcorn, the gleam of a flashlight on a closet wall, the sound of soft giggles, and each memory was both precious and unbearable, a reminder of what had been ripped away. Family photographs became relics of a time that no longer existed. Every captured smile, every frozen moment in film and print, held the weight of loss too vast to comprehend. The community, while sympathetic, could not fully understand the depth of their suffering. Friends stopped by to offer comfort, but even their words fell short. "It will be okay," they said, and each syllable felt like an echo in a cathedral of absence. Family members became isolated, retreating into their grief, each person navigating the loss in isolation, afraid that voicing their despair too loudly might shatter the fragile veneer of normalcy for others. Conversations were clipped, laughter rare, and silence became a constant companion, as if speaking too much might make the children's disappearance somehow more permanent. Time did not heal, it only deepened the wound. Each passing day, each birthday, each holiday became a cruel reminder of what had been lost. The mother marked the calendar obsessively, noting dates when the children should have been home, creating a ritual of remembrance that kept the missing close, yet magnified the impossibility of their return. She often spoke aloud to them, recounting the day's events, whispering hopes and fears, acknowledging the invisible gap where they once belonged. The father, meanwhile, wrestled with a gnawing anger at the world, at fate, at circumstance, at the unknown forces that had taken them. His guilt interlaced with this anger, a complex knot that refused to unravel, leaving him raw and exhausted. Even ordinary objects, their beds, their toys, their clothes, became charged with memory. Picking up a small shoe or a folded sweater could trigger a wave of emotion so intense it left the family momentarily paralyzed. Meals were eaten in silence, rooms passed through cautiously, and laughter, once natural, felt foreign. The household was alive with echoes, voices that were no longer there, the persistent imprint of 5 children who had once animated the space with warmth and energy. In the quietest moments, those echoes seemed almost real, as if the siblings had never left, hovering just out of reach, teasing, calling, waiting. Therapy was a foreign concept in 1974, and yet each family member sought their own ways to process grief. Some turned inward, some outward, some sought the company of others, but all carried the same shadow. Nights were long and sleepless, days stretched endlessly, punctuated by moments of panic, hope, or despair. The family became a study in fractured routines, rituals performed not out of necessity, but to stave off the collapse of memory and identity. Each act, no matter how small, was a tether to the children who had vanished, a fragile lifeline in a reality that had been irreversibly altered. Even decades later, the emotional reverberations persisted. Relatives would recall the incident with a tremor in their voice, their faces shadowed with sorrow and lingering guilt. They described the sensation of returning to a house that was at once familiar and alien, of stepping into spaces imbued with absence, of moving through rooms haunted by laughter that could never again be heard. Memories were both balm and wound, comforting in their vividness yet cruel in their reminder of all that had been lost. The family, though surviving, carried an invisible scar, a testament to the way that trauma, when unhealed, embeds itself in the architecture of the everyday. In the end, the loss of these 5 siblings was more than a physical disappearance. It became an emotional landscape, a psychological labyrinth from which the family could not escape. Each room, each object, each sound within the house was a portal to memory and longing, a space where grief and love were intertwined inseparably. The tragedy was not just in their absence, but in the way that absence reshaped everything that remained, the very essence of family, home, and belonging. The moment the authorities were called, the disappearance transformed from a personal tragedy into a procedural puzzle, one that demanded methodical investigation and an almost obsessive attention to detail. Detectives arrived at the house, their shoes squeaking on polished floors, their eyes scanning every corner for the faintest irregularity. They moved deliberately, measuring the angles of doorways, inspecting windows, and tracing the paths the children might have taken. Notes were scribbled furiously, cameras clicked to preserve evidence, and every question was catalogued for follow-up. Yet, with each careful step, the investigators were confronted not with answers, but with a growing void. The house offered nothing beyond the faint scent of popcorn and the soft echoes of laughter that lingered like a ghost. Witnesses were interviewed, their accounts often conflicting or incomplete. Neighbors recalled glimpses of shadows moving behind curtains, a stranger passing the street at odd hours, or the faint sound of children's voices drifting in the night. Yet none of these details formed a coherent narrative. Each lead seemed promising for a moment, only to collapse under scrutiny. One officer would trace footprints in the damp grass, convinced they belonged to the missing, while another would note that the prints disappeared abruptly, as if swallowed by the earth itself. The investigators found themselves walking a labyrinth of partial truths, each turn leading to more questions than resolutions. Detectives began reconstructing the timeline in painstaking detail, mapping every movement from the evening before the disappearance. They interviewed family members, replayed accounts of games played, conversations shared, and the children's interactions with one another. But every recollection was tinged with the unknowable, filtered through memory, fear, and grief. What one family member recalled vividly, another had forgotten entirely. Inconsistencies multiplied, and the case began to feel less like a search for tangible facts and more like an attempt to make sense of an impossible absence. Outside the house, the community offered both assistance and distraction. Volunteers scoured nearby woods, empty lots, and alleys. Journalists converged on the neighborhood, their questions probing, their cameras persistent, their curiosity mingled with morbid fascination. The investigators felt pressure from all sides, families desperate for answers, townspeople impatient for progress, and the relentless gaze of a public unwilling to accept silence. The procedural rigor of their training collided with the emotional weight of the situation, creating a tension that was almost unbearable. Each hour that passed without progress intensified the sense that something fundamental had been overlooked, some crucial detail hidden in plain sight. The investigators themselves were human, and the case began to exact a toll on them as well. Detectives who had spent careers chasing criminals found themselves grappling with a different kind of terror, the ineffable, the inexplicable, the knowledge that no matter how carefully they examined the world, it could still conceal entire lives behind familiar walls. Sleepless nights became routine. Officers replayed interviews in their heads, turned over objects in imagined sequences, and retraced paths through neighborhoods that had long since fallen silent. Frustration, anxiety, and doubt intertwined, leaving even the most seasoned investigators questioning their own competence. Suspicions arose in every direction. Was it an abduction by a stranger? An elaborate hoax? A family secret gone tragically wrong? Every theory was examined rigorously, yet no single explanation fit all the facts. Investigators found themselves stuck between possibilities, unable to confirm any of them. The pressure to produce answers clashed with the stubborn silence of reality, creating a psychological tension that mirrored the family's own torment. Each new lead brought a surge of hope, only to be followed by crushing disappointment when it dissolved into uncertainty. The physical search extended beyond the house. Officers scoured the surrounding area with meticulous care, walking through fields, streams, and wooded paths. Dogs were brought in, trained to detect scents, yet even the most skilled animals failed to locate a trace. Search grids were drawn and redrawn. The town, which had once been quiet and predictable, became a landscape of constant movement, the streets filled with uniforms and concerned citizens, all collectively haunted by the knowledge that 5 children had disappeared without explanation. The detectives' methodical work was precise, but the absence of results began to take on an almost supernatural quality, suggesting that the missing were no longer part of the world as everyone knew it. Interrogations added another layer of tension. Neighbors, family acquaintances, and even distant relatives were questioned repeatedly, their statements scrutinized for discrepancies. Some were forthcoming, others defensive, and a few were inexplicably silent. Every encounter seemed to deepen the mystery rather than resolve it. The investigators began to feel that they were chasing shadows, that every word, every recollection, could either illuminate the truth or pull them further into confusion. The sense of being trapped in a puzzle without a solution weighed heavily on their minds, echoing the family's own experience of helplessness and grief. Weeks turned into months, and the case became a symbol of frustration and despair for the community and law enforcement alike. Leads went cold. Promising clues dissolved into contradictions. Files piled up, evidence boxes remained unopened, and officers rotated off the case, leaving behind a trail of partial insights and unanswered questions. The investigators who remained were left to grapple with the psychological burden of a mystery that seemed to defy logic, their professional identities tested against the relentless silence of an unresolved tragedy. Through it all, a haunting realization settled over everyone involved. Some absences are not just physical, but existential. The 5 siblings had vanished not just from their home, but from the expected order of life itself, leaving detectives, family, and community members alike to confront a reality where certainty no longer applied. The investigation, meticulous and unyielding, could account for evidence, witness statements, and timelines, but it could not account for the emotional vacuum left behind. And in that void, fear, doubt, and grief intertwined, creating a darkness as palpable as the night in which the children had disappeared. As the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, the house itself seemed to take on a life of its own. Once filled with laughter and warmth, it became a quiet, brooding presence on the street, its windows reflecting the world outside while hiding the emptiness within. Neighbors would slow their steps as they passed by, glancing at the sagging porch or the faint shadows in curtained windows, sensing that something had shifted irrevocably. The house was no longer merely a home, it had become a vessel of absence, a monument to what had vanished in the middle of an ordinary night. Its walls held memories that were impossible to articulate, the echoes of small voices suspended in time, replaying endlessly in the minds of those who had once lived there. Inside, the rooms were frozen in a way that felt almost deliberate. Beds remained unmade, blankets twisted as though children had just left them, toys scattered as if a game had been interrupted. Each object carried the weight of loss, every detail a testament to the ordinary life that had been stolen. The wallpaper, once cheerful and bright, now seemed muted, shadows stretching along it in ways that made the familiar unfamiliar. Furniture bore the faint impressions of small bodies, the subtle indentations of childhood movement now turned into silent reminders of absence. The house was no longer merely inhabited, it was haunted, not by spirits, but by memory itself, by the presence of those who had been taken without explanation. Neighbors began to speak in hushed tones of strange occurrences. Some claimed to hear laughter echoing through the empty hallways, soft giggles that faded when approached. Others said they saw fleeting movements in the upper windows, glimpses of shadows that could not belong to anyone. The town, already traumatized by the disappearance, began to project its collective unease onto the house, assigning it a personality, a will, a secret it refused to reveal. Children who once played freely nearby now avoided the lawn, as if sensing that the air itself was charged with something unseen and unknowable. The passage of time only intensified the house's presence as a character in its own right. Dust collected in corners, untouched for years, and the faint smell of mildew mingled with the lingering scent of family life. Each creak of the floorboards, each whisper of wind through the cracked windows, became amplified in the stillness. Visitors reported feeling watched, a subtle pressure that seemed to press against the skin, a silent awareness that the house remembered everything, even when no one else could. It was as though the structure itself had absorbed grief, transforming it into an almost tangible atmosphere that clung to anyone who entered. For the family, returning to the house was an ordeal. Rooms that had once been sources of comfort now struck them with the weight of memory. Each step stirred emotions they could not contain, fear, longing, guilt, and love, all entangled in ways that seemed to resist articulation. The attic, once a place of games and hiding spots, became a cavern of imagined horrors, each shadow a reminder of what might have happened, each floorboard a threshold to uncertainty. The house, once ordinary and safe, now exerted a psychological gravity, drawing every thought back to the missing children and the unanswerable questions surrounding their disappearance. The investigators, too, felt the house's pull. Even the most rational officers, trained to rely on evidence and logic, admitted to experiencing a strange unease when stepping inside. Hallways seemed longer than memory suggested, rooms darker, corners deeper. Objects appeared in unexpected places, or vanished entirely. Every creaking door or rustling curtain took on significance, a potential clue or threat, forcing them to question the boundaries between perception and reality. The house resisted explanation, defying reason while holding onto its secrets tightly. As the years stretched into decades, the house remained largely untouched, a frozen capsule of 1974. Neighbors whispered that it was cursed, or that it had absorbed the sorrow of the family into its very walls. Its presence became a mirror for the town's own unresolved grief, a place where imagination and memory collided. People passing by could sense that life had been paused there, the ordinary rhythms interrupted, the innocence of childhood suspended in the eerie quiet of a house that had once been filled with laughter. Yet even in abandonment, the house seemed alive with the energy of what had once been. Faint marks on walls, scuffed floors, and small remnants of toys hinted at lives that had once moved through it with vitality. The house became a silent witness, preserving evidence of existence even as the children themselves remained absent. It was as though every object, every creak of timber, held the secret of what had occurred, keeping it safe from the outside world, waiting for someone to notice, to understand, to uncover the truth buried within. The house, in its stillness, became a psychological landscape for everyone connected to the tragedy. It was a space where grief, memory, and unanswered questions converged, a locus for the invisible threads that tied the family, investigators, and community together in shared trauma. Its presence reminded all who approached that some losses are not just measured in absence, but in the way the world itself shifts around them, in the way ordinary life bends to accommodate a void that can never truly be filled. And so the house endured, a silent character in the long story of grief, haunting, waiting, holding its breath for the day when its hidden truths might finally emerge, when the echoes of 1974 could be confronted, when the walls themselves might reveal the story of the children who had vanished within them. As the years passed, the urgency that had gripped the town in 1974 began to ebb, replaced by a creeping, almost tangible silence. The initial flurry of activity, the search parties, police investigations, and media coverage, faded into memory, leaving behind only the lingering ache of absence. Files were filed away, folders labeled and stacked in dusty archives, their contents largely forgotten by everyone outside law enforcement. Detectives who had worked tirelessly on the case retired, moved on, or were reassigned, leaving behind a void of expertise and continuity. What had been a living, breathing search for answers became a static monument in the annals of unsolved disappearances, a cold case defined as much by what could not be discovered as by the fragments of what once existed. The family, already fractured by grief, began to scatter under the weight of their unrelenting loss. The mother, who had once wandered the empty halls daily, slowly withdrew into herself, retreating from the world and from the possibility of any comforting resolution. Her movements became smaller, slower, as if each step carried the weight of decades of sorrow. The father, who had once walked the yard in endless pacing, measuring distances and imagining scenarios, began to speak less and less, his gaze fixed on horizons beyond the physical world, haunted by questions he could never answer. Siblings grew up under the shadow of an event that had reshaped their understanding of family, childhood, and safety. Their lives were measured against the absence of the missing children, their own joy tempered by the unspoken knowledge that 5 of their own had vanished into silence. The house remained unchanged, a frozen monument to the night when ordinary life fractured. For those who passed by, it was both familiar and alien. Its boarded windows and neglected lawn spoke of time's passage, but the energy within seemed suspended, untouched by the decades. Neighbors whispered about the stillness that clung to it, about how the air around the home seemed heavier, charged with memory. It became a place to avoid, yet impossible to forget, a haunting reminder that life could be irrevocably altered in a single moment. Even the police seemed to recognize the house as more than structure. It had become a symbol of unresolved grief and the limits of human understanding. Occasionally, the case would resurface in local newspapers or in the annals of crime compilations, a brief reminder that the children had existed and that no explanation had ever emerged. These reminders were like jolts of cold water to the community, momentarily stirring the memory of fear and loss before it receded again into the quiet. Family members felt these reminders acutely, as if each mention in print reopened a wound they had carried silently for years. The absence of closure was a constant companion, shaping their decisions, their relationships, and the very way they navigated the world. The law enforcement files, once meticulously organized, became a testament to the complexity of absence. Evidence boxes, witness statements, and sketches accumulated dust. Some details, once considered promising, were lost to time. Fingerprints faded, photographs deteriorated, and notes were misplaced. Investigators who returned years later to review the case often described a sense of disorientation, as if the investigation itself had been swallowed by time. The case became emblematic of the difficulties inherent in missing persons investigations, particularly when no body, no suspect, and no tangible leads existed to provide certainty. As the town aged, so too did the collective memory of the event, filtered through rumor and speculation. Younger generations learned of it secondhand, through stories told by older neighbors or family members, their imaginations filling in gaps with shadows of the past. The original horror of the night became mythologized in subtle ways, woven into the fabric of local culture. Halloween gatherings, schoolyard conversations, and whispered tales all carried echoes of a loss that had never been resolved, a reminder that absence could linger longer than any living memory. Despite the official decline in investigative energy, some private efforts persisted. Amateur sleuths, distant relatives, and obsessed individuals occasionally re-examined the case files, poring over old photographs and witness statements in the hope of uncovering overlooked details. Yet even the most meticulous of these examinations revealed only the stubborn persistence of silence. The house, the neighborhood, and the town had absorbed decades of unanswered questions, each unanswered query adding layers to the psychological weight of the story. The children's disappearance became less a mystery of fact and more a study of absence itself, a haunting meditation on what remains when certainty is forever denied. For the family, the cold years were a slow erosion of hope, punctuated by fleeting moments of despair and the occasional spark of optimism that always faded too quickly. Birthdays, holidays, and anniversaries were celebrated in the shadow of what had been lost. The family's routine was a delicate choreography of memory and denial, each day a careful navigation between acknowledging the past and attempting to continue living. Therapy was rare and stigmatized in the era, leaving each person to invent their own methods of coping, some through quiet reflection, others through obsessive attention to detail or ritual, all striving to maintain a tether to lives forever altered. And yet, even in these cold, silent years, the story remained alive. It lived in the walls of the house, in the conversations whispered behind closed doors, in the cautious glances of neighbors and the weight of decades-long absence. Time could not erase what had happened, it could only amplify the emptiness, stretching it across generations and reshaping lives in ways that were subtle, psychological, and deeply profound. The disappearance had transcended its original context, becoming more than an event. It had become a shadow, a persistent ache that no passage of time could fully soften. In the quietest moments, when the town seemed most ordinary and life resumed its predictable rhythms, the absence of the 5 siblings could still be felt, pressing on the consciousness of all who remembered. It was a presence without form, a haunting that lived in silence, a reminder that not all mysteries resolve and that some truths lie hidden for decades, waiting for the moment when time, chance, or circumstance might finally bring them into the light. Decades after the initial disappearance, the case seemed almost forgotten, relegated to the quiet corners of law enforcement archives and the fading memories of those who had lived through the horror. Yet, as the early 2000s arrived, the story resurfaced in ways the family and town could never have anticipated. The rise of the internet and online forums provided a new stage for collective curiosity, a platform where the unknown could be dissected and debated with an intensity previously impossible. Amateur sleuths, true crime enthusiasts, and local history buffs began poring over every fragment of information they could find, resurrecting photographs, old newspaper clippings, and witness statements that had lain dormant for decades. The case, once confined to whispers and memory, exploded into a cacophony of speculation. Online discussions ranged from the mundane to the bizarre. Some focused on the most logical explanations, the possibility of abduction by a stranger, perhaps someone with detailed knowledge of the family's routines. Others wandered into the realm of conspiracy, suggesting secret cults, hidden tunnels beneath the town, or involvement by powerful individuals who had manipulated events from behind the scenes. Every theory found its champions, each discussion thread a small vortex of hope, fear, and obsession. Participants dissected the children's ages, personalities, and last known activities with painstaking care, attempting to reconstruct a timeline that had long resisted reconstruction. In these forums, the past became a living, breathing narrative, constantly reshaped by the interpretations, biases, and anxieties of those who engaged with it. For the family, the resurgence was both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, renewed attention offered the faintest glimmer of hope, a possibility, however distant, that answers might finally be uncovered. On the other, the intensity of speculation reopened wounds long thought scarred over, exposing the raw nerves of grief and memory to the public gaze. They read about theories ranging from the plausible to the absurd, each one a reminder that the world still watched, judged, and wondered about the fate of their children. The internet's reach amplified the sense of exposure. Private sorrow became public obsession, and with it came an inescapable feeling of vulnerability. As discussions proliferated, a strange energy settled over the town. Local reporters, sensing renewed interest, revisited the story, interviewing former neighbors and family friends, often dredging up memories that were painful to recall. Some townspeople felt a resurgence of fear, as if the past itself had returned to haunt the present. Children who had once played near the missing siblings' home now asked their parents questions they could not answer, and adults who had long tried to move on were reminded, sharply and cruelly, that certain absences cannot be softened by time. The collective consciousness of the town shifted, subtly but irrevocably, under the weight of stories half remembered and theories half believed. Rumors, by their nature, gained a life of their own. A neighbor recalled seeing a figure near the house on the night of the disappearance, an account that may have been inaccurate, distorted by decades of memory, but it fueled speculation, inspiring countless posts and debates online. Others offered photographs of the home, some current, some decades old, scrutinized with obsessive attention for signs of hidden doors, shadows, or unusual alterations. Each detail became magnified, every imperfection imbued with meaning, transforming ordinary observations into potential evidence of an elaborate mystery. The psychological impact of this renewed attention on the family was profound. They oscillated between hope, dread, and exhaustion. Some days, they found comfort in the idea that others still remembered their children, that the story of their lives, and their loss, was not entirely forgotten. On other days, they felt invaded, as if their grief were being consumed by a relentless, impersonal curiosity. The past, once locked away behind layers of personal memory, had been reopened, its edges raw and bleeding. Every conversation, every comment, every speculative post online chipped away at the fragile barrier that had allowed them to continue living with the absence of the children. Amid the noise of speculation, law enforcement quietly revisited old files. Amateur sleuths occasionally uncovered overlooked details, prompting brief surges of official attention. A previously disregarded witness statement might spark weeks of investigation, or a photograph might lead to renewed interviews with individuals long believed to be unconnected to the case. The combination of amateur tenacity and professional diligence created a tension between the controlled methods of investigation and the chaotic energy of public curiosity. Each new lead brought renewed hope, yet also renewed frustration, as the past remained stubbornly resistant to interpretation. The atmosphere surrounding the case shifted further as local historians and journalists produced documentaries, blog posts, and podcasts exploring the disappearance. These narratives wove together fact, recollection, and speculation, painting the missing siblings as figures suspended in time, forever caught between childhood and mystery. They emphasized the haunting quality of the empty house, the unspoken tension in the family, and the unresolved questions that had lingered for decades. In doing so, the story transcended its original context, becoming both a local legend and a point of fascination for anyone drawn to unresolved human mysteries. Ultimately, the resurgence of rumors and speculation illuminated a paradox. The story of the missing siblings could never truly be forgotten, yet it could never fully be understood. Time had deepened the wounds even as it created the space for new exploration. The past, though fixed in chronology, became fluid in interpretation, reshaped by collective memory, conjecture, and desire for resolution. The case was alive again, not through new evidence, but through the enduring human need to understand what cannot be explained, to fill silence with narrative, and to confront the uncomfortable truth that some mysteries refuse closure. Even as the town, the family, and the investigators braced themselves against the revival of attention, one fact remained constant: the children were still gone. The questions multiplied, the speculation intensified, and yet the truth remained hidden, locked behind decades of absence and the quiet walls of a house that remembered far more than anyone could see. The resurgence of curiosity was a reminder that mysteries do not die, they linger, they echo, and they demand that we keep asking, even when answers remain agonizingly out of reach. By the time the house was reopened, nearly 5 decades had passed since that fateful October night in 1974. The passage of years had cloaked it in layers of dust and memory, a structure suspended between the world that once animated it and the silence that had grown into something almost tangible. The decision to reopen the home was not taken lightly. The family, long carrying the weight of absence, hoped desperately that some long-buried truth might emerge. Investigators, old and new, approached the task with both caution and urgency, aware that decades of time had likely obscured evidence, yet understanding that the possibility of resolution, however faint, demanded meticulous effort. The initial walkthrough of the house was an eerie experience. Every room felt weighted with the invisible presence of the children who had disappeared. Beds were no longer neatly made but bore the faint impressions of decades-old use, the carpet still marked by the scuffs of tiny feet that had once darted across its surface. The air itself seemed thick, heavy with the memory of laughter, whispers, and sudden squeals of delight that could not be fully erased. Investigators noted how shadows clung to corners, how the slightest sound, creaking floorboards, a draft through a cracked window, was magnified in the uncanny stillness. Each step felt simultaneously intrusive and reverent, a negotiation with the past that demanded both care and courage. Attention turned quickly to the closets, hallways, and spaces that had long been overlooked or dismissed. Decades of normal wear and minor renovations had hidden subtle inconsistencies in the structure. Odd seams in the wallpaper, unusual gaps beneath baseboards, and faint irregularities in floorboards that hinted at something more. Experienced investigators knew that, in cases like this, the smallest anomaly could hold enormous significance. They measured walls, inspected floors with precision tools, and documented every minute detail with photographs, video, and notes. Yet, despite the painstaking process, the sense of suspense was palpable. Something hidden, something long kept secret, seemed to hang just beyond perception. As the team began to probe deeper, they discovered an area of the house that had been largely ignored, a small closet tucked away in a rarely used hallway. Its door was unassuming, its latch unremarkable, yet the wood around the frame bore subtle signs of alteration, almost imperceptible without careful inspection. Investigators paused, the tension in the room thickening as they approached. The closet, which had been considered ordinary for decades, suddenly demanded full attention. The air smelled faintly of mold and age, yet beneath that was something else, an indistinct but undeniable trace of the children's presence, lingering invisibly, a silent witness waiting to be acknowledged. Inside the closet, every detail was scrutinized. The shelves, the back wall, and the floor revealed subtle clues, small scratches, faint scuff marks, and unusual gaps suggesting that something had been deliberately concealed. Investigators photographed and catalogued each observation, their hearts racing with the possibility that they were on the verge of uncovering a secret long hidden from the world. The quiet of the house seemed to amplify every movement, the faint scrape of a foot against a floorboard echoing through empty rooms. Each breath, each sound, became a reminder that history had left its imprint here, waiting patiently for discovery. The emotional impact on the family was immediate. Those who had long suppressed grief and speculation now confronted the tangible possibility that a clue, perhaps the key to decades of unanswered questions, lay hidden in a space they had walked past countless times. Memories surged forward, vivid and jarring, the sound of footsteps racing down a hallway, the muffled laughter of children playing hide-and-seek, the weight of blankets tossed across the floor. The closet, once mundane, had transformed into a portal to the past, a place where the ordinary had once intersected with the extraordinary. Investigators worked with extreme care, aware that decades-old structures could hide both evidence and fragile traces of human presence. They measured the dimensions of the closet, tapped walls for hollow sounds, and employed specialized tools to detect any concealed compartments. Every inch was examined repeatedly, each layer peeled back with the meticulous patience of those who understand that a single overlooked detail could shift the course of understanding entirely. The air was thick with anticipation, the kind of psychological pressure that comes from standing at the threshold of revelation, where the boundary between ordinary life and unimaginable discovery is razor-thin. Outside the immediate circle of investigators, the atmosphere in the house affected everyone present. The family, long resigned to absence, now confronted the disorienting tension of hope and fear intertwined. Could the long-lost children somehow have left a trace here, a final testament to their presence or to the events of that night? The room itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting, aware of the possibility that decades of silence might finally be broken. Each subtle creak, each shadow cast by the light of a flashlight, became magnified, transformed from mundane reality into a suggestion that something previously hidden was about to emerge. It was during this painstaking examination that a faint seam in the closet's back wall caught the attention of one investigator. At first, it seemed minor, almost imperceptible. But repeated scrutiny revealed that the panel had been deliberately constructed to conceal a space behind it. Hearts pounded, the weight of decades of unanswered questions pressing on everyone in the room. For 50 years, this small, overlooked closet had contained a secret that, until now, had remained invisible. The realization sent a shiver through both family